Good morning and thank you for joining us. Kate Jolly from Effective Governance, part of Hopgood Gunner. Really delighted to be here and thank you for joining us for our discussion regarding sports and complaints and how to manage them. A lot of questions we're going to table today, and it is a question approach. And delighted to have with us for this discussion, we've got Anna Croger from Swimming Australia. Thank you. We've got Dr. Rachel Baird, one of our specialist advisors from Effective Governance, and we've got John Urbacher, a senior associate of Hopgood Gunner. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Today is going to be an informal discussion, and we have been talking more about questions than answers. We have got Anna's background being in the specialist of the National Integrity Framework spectrum. Can we start with that?
Yeah, look, I have worked in a number of different sports and work in integrity has shifted. After the Wood Review in 2018, there were 52 recommendations, and two of those recommendations were to establish Sports Integrity Australia and an Integrity Commission and the National Sports Tribunal. So we are getting a lot of questions through at the moment from a variety of sports on the National Integrity Framework as more sports start to adopt it, and how that will work for national sporting organisations, state sporting organisations and clubs, and how they work with Sports Integrity Australia to manage prohibited conduct under the policies. So there are four main policies under the National Integrity Framework. Drugs and medicine safeguarding, member protection, and complaints. So that's and obviously sports wagering as well. Sorry. So that's the sort of policy framework. Each of those policies have prohibited conduct, which are then, if it falls within a complaint falls within the ambit of prohibited conduct, it is dealt with under the complaints policy. So that's essentially what the new National Integrity Framework looks like for sports that are adopting it.
So, given that's what it's looking like, where are we at in the progress stage? Like, how do we know how to deal with a complaint? Just given your background, you've had a strong background in this process, is that right? Yeah.
So Swimming Australia has only just resolved to adopt the NIF, so we haven't had any complaints managed under this integrity process yet. There's only 18 sports so far that have adopted the NIF, but I expect that there'll be a lot more come 30 June, particularly around Olympic sports. So I haven't had a matter, or our head of integrity hasn't had a matter that's been dealt with under the National Integrity Framework as yet. But essentially what will happen is, if someone has a complaint that fits within the ambit of prohibited conduct under one of the policies, they can submit a complaint to Sports Integrity Australia. There's an online form. Sports Integrity Australia will assess that complaint to see if it falls within the scope of the National Integrity Framework, and then they'll independently assess that complaint. If it doesn't fall within the scope of the National Integrity Framework, it'll be referred back to the sport to manage under other policies and procedures that they have in place, such as codes of conduct.
But to confirm, they need to be registered, they need to be part of the...
For SIA to manage it. So for SIA to manage a complaint, they have to have adopted the National Integrity Framework. That's right.
And how far do you think we're in that? Are there many that have adopted it?
So there's 18 sports, I understand, that have adopted the framework. I think we'll find by 30 June there will be a lot more sports. There may be some, and I don't know, there may be some professional sports that just opt not to adopt the National Integrity Framework and have had their policies endorsed by Sports Integrity Australia to meet their integrity requirements. So there may be sports in that boat. I don't know how many of those there are, and I suspect it will be professional sports that have already got very robust frameworks in place. I can't imagine that there's going to be a whole lot of Olympic sports that won't adopt the National Integrity Framework because it provides an external independent body and a number of benefits to assess complaints. So, I don't know what level of discussion C have had with various sports.
Thanks, Anna. John, can I ask you, in your role, where do you see that fitting in? You've recently been appointed to the National Tribunal.
Yeah, the National Sports Tribunal, which is another one of the results of the Wood report, the Wood review that Anna just mentioned. That's something that's sort of new to me. I'm in the second intake of members of the tribunal that happened recently, just at the end of last year. So there are currently about 40-odd members actively running matters in the tribunal, and there's another 40 members who have just been appointed. So I'm yet to get involved in any specific matters, but that'll be on the card shortly. But yeah, the National Sports Tribunal is obviously been set up to try to create an even playing field for determining disputes in sport. Traditionally, sporting organisations have liked to manage their disputes themselves, and that's because the issues arise on a contractual basis, and generally there'll be a constitution or articles of association or rules and regulations of the sport, or these days member protection policies and those sorts of things that govern the sports and the sporting bodies. But obviously every sport is different. Every sport has a different policy in place, and some have no policies in place. Yeah. So the National Sports Tribunal is basically setting up a procedure that can be followed by all national sports and any state sports that have a policy in place that's adopted by their national body. So yeah, look, it's still in a trial phase at the moment. They're doing a 2-year pilot program that's recently been extended for another year, I think. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what the uptake is. At the moment, it's been these things happen slowly, of course. I think there have been about 30 or so matters that have gone through the tribunal so far.
In what time frame?
Over the past 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah, but obviously it's been a pretty wild couple of years that we've had with everything that's going on in the world, and and as I said, things change slowly. So yeah, the NST, National Sports Tribunal, is one of the initiatives that has come out of the Wood report, and I think we'll see it sort of really start becoming the popular choice for NSOs to adopt.
Thank you. I'm going to throw it over to you, Rachel, if you don't mind, because you've got a lot of questions amongst all of this, and we've talked about it a lot. And a lot of the questions are about where do our complaints go, at what level and when. We've got a tribunal, fantastic. We've got a framework, fantastic. If you're a small little organisation or even a larger one that may not fit eligibility, where do we go?
Yeah, and that's the question I'm really grappling with. And to use a sporting analogy, the time is now to start training and preparing for when complaints come in. And we know that complaints are an inevitable part of life and in sporting organisations. So, and I'm really my focus is on those behavioural type of issues that might come under a member protection policy or code of conduct, because I understand there's some things that are outside the NIF, which would be like selection policies and things like that. They're outside the NIF. But again, I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at hundreds of thousands of Australians play sport, so there's always going to be that issue. So what can organisations do to prepare themselves now? And so it's regardless of whether they might ultimately adopt the NIF or fall under the sports tribunal, is having a policy, and that might be a complaints policy that flows from the NIF, or it might be their own complaints policy, or it might be one that comes from the NSO, but having that policy. And I've seen a few being reviewed recently, making sure that the word complaint is actually defined, for example, so they understand what they're getting. And I know I'm taking that right back to basics, and the NIF and the tribunal are at a higher level, but understanding, is it actually a complaint? Is your threshold that it has to be in writing? So, for example, with the CEO, I know that they have a form, but it could be on a hotline. But then, does that mean that after the hotline call, do they only need it in writing? But at the sport level, can a complaint be verbal? Doesn't have to be in writing. What is it? Is it a complaint? How do you communicate? How do you triage that? What are your first 24 hours of action? Having a flow chart. How do you then make sure, as John alluded to, that independence of is it independently investigated? Does a policy cover? I saw one policy recently that was really great, but what are the complaints about the board member or the CEO? And it was silent on that. So there's I think there's a lot of homework to be done right now, or training, if we want to go back to a sporting analogy, to be done right now to be fit when it goes pear-shaped.
Yeah, great questions, and fit for when is a really good one. What I picked up from what you were just talking about is that triage. It's when do you know you've got something to deal with? And then what do you do with it when you think you've got something to do with? Anna, your view?
Yeah, so I think you need to first assess what the nature of the complaint is, and whether it fits the definition of prohibited conduct under one of the Sports Integrity Australia policies. If it falls outside that definition of prohibited conduct, you need to look to your sport to find out what policies and procedures are in place that might cover that particular type of issue. So, for example, prohibited conduct under the member protection policy are things like abuse, bullying and inappropriate use of power, harassment, sexual harassment and sexual offences, discrimination, victimisation of anyone who chooses to make a complaint or plans to, and vilification based on a particular characteristic. If it's a matter that is an eligibility or selection matter, a personal grievance, a competition-related issue, those types of issues will fall outside of the NIF, and you will need to have policies and procedures, or the sport will need to have policies and procedures in place to manage those types of issues. And that will just depend on the size of the sport, as to what kind of framework they have in place. So, at a club level, there should be policies that you can adopt from your state or your NSO, and there should be a point of contact within your state or your NSO. Very small sports may struggle to have those resources in place. The NIF does put in place a complaints manager, so I would be looking and seeking to find out who that complaints manager is within your sport, if your sport has adopted the NIF, so that they can help you work through whether it will fall under a NIF policy or whether it will fall under another suite of policies that your sport might have.
So, sorry to interrupt, but do you think that's a really reasonable first question for anyone who's listening, is to go to if they're part of a NSO, and ask that question about, have you adopted the NIF? What does this mean for us? And get those questions answered. If you haven't, what does this mean for us?
Absolutely. I think that's your very first point of call, is find out whether or not your sport has adopted the National Integrity Framework, and if so, from what date? Where can I find copies of those policies? Who are your complaints managers? And start asking those questions so you know who to go to and where you can find support. Absolutely.
John, can I ask you, can you explain the jurisdiction of the tribunal a little bit further?
Yeah, sure. And it sort of flows out of what Anna's been talking about. There are 3 divisions to the National Sports Tribunal. There's the anti-doping division, and then a general division that deals with all sorts of disputes that might arise under a member protection policy, and then there's an appeals division. So, as Anna was saying, the Sports Tribunal will determine disputes relating to various things, things like anti-doping, rule violations, disciplinary disputes, selection, eligibility disputes, bullying, harassment, other sorts of discrimination type disputes like that. The things that the tribunal won't deal with, though, are your contractual disputes arising out of, your wages disputes or your employment-related disputes, or a dispute where someone's seeking to recover damages from someone, something like that. And then your on-field disputes, things like that. So those on-field indiscretions will be dealt with by the internal mechanisms of the sport. So there'll still be a role to play for internal dispute resolution mechanisms of each sporting body, and also for the courts and tribunals of law. So the NST is not an answer to every dispute that's going to arise in sport, but it is in terms of the integrity framework of those issues. it will aim to determine those disputes.
Excellent, thanks. Rachel, have you got any questions around that?
Well, I think it was interesting listening to that. I think what makes the code of conduct or the member protection complaints or issues so unique is that often there's a time pressure. So if it's a wages dispute or a selection dispute, there's a time pressure, I guess, if they're about to go and compete no longer in the team. But there's often that time to react immediately because you've had a complaint that's personal. And I think where the organisations can come unstuck is where they feel obligated to respond straight away without first checking, is it through the NIF, is it through their policy, how do they respond? But they get caught up in that 24/7 media cycle or whatever it is, or the fact that they don't have a policy, so they make it up on the go. And I think that's all of these issues that we're talking about really highlight that importance of understanding your policies beforehand. So when it comes in, you can actually go, well, where does it fall? What is it? And
So
how do
are
I
we
treat?
talking about having policies that either fall under the framework or don't?
Well, I guess whether they do or they don't, it's knowing what your unique situation is, so that when it comes in, you can look at it and go, oh, it looks like a member protection policy issue. Oh, it looks like a selection policy issue. I mean, I know we're asking a lot of our sporting organisations to have all that knowledge because I'm confused, but preparing as much as I can, like Anna said, finding out who that complaints
The
manager
National
is.
Integrity Manager and the
Yeah.
Complaints Manager will be key to that, helping clubs and state sporting organisation working out where this fits in based on that NSO's particular policy framework. But I think you make a really good point. In my experience with member protection and complaints in sport, and my experience in sport is that people are emotional and they want a fast response, or they will go to the media. And so I think, there is a responsiveness in this. The longer you leave these types of matters, in my experience, the worse they become. And so being able to get on the phone to someone and saying, we have received your complaint, it is at this stage in whatever assessment process, so that someone feels heard and knows that someone is going to do something with their complaint, is really important. I think that's going to be critical, and it will be really interesting to see how sports and SIA work together with that communication, because SIA will be managing a lot of different matters, and ensuring that the complainant and the respondent are aware of where it is at in the process will be really critical as to whether people feel satisfied with this type of framework and with the National Sports Tribunal. If people are left not knowing for a period of time, I think we'll see matters really blow up, because they're highly emotive in sport. It's not a corporate transaction. People care, and they care deeply about these matters in their sport.
Yep, agree. And perhaps exactly why we're having the conversation today. Rachel, love your thoughts on that.
I've seen it in some of the work I've done with sports, and you get the best and the worst from people, right? Because they're there because they're passionate, but that can be their Achilles heel because they might not necessarily see the objective way through it. So then when you throw a complaint in the mix, and you've got two parties, and you've also got to protect the sport, so it's really three vested interests. And then you've got someone who's managing it, and they may, I think the beauty of having these policies is it will give whoever has to, whoever the unlucky person is answers the phone or sitting at the desk or in that role, it gives them the confidence to go, there's a playbook to follow, instead of having to make it up, because the last thing they want to do is make it worse for the complainant or the respondent or the sport. They don't want the sport on the front page of the Australian either.
Yeah, and the beauty of SIA, and I think one of the true benefits of having Sports Integrity Australia managing complaints, and certainly that fall within the prohibited conduct under each of those policies, is that they'll be independently assessed. So there can no longer be this view that, well, this sport won't manage it because I'll just sweep it under the carpet. Which is certainly not been my experience in sport, but there is that independent body now that, particularly around these more serious prohibited conduct type matters, there is an independent body that will be assessing them.
Yeah, and over time we develop court precedents essentially, and we have a bit of an idea as to how different issues are going to be treated, and that is one of the objectives of the National Sports Tribunal, so that we can move away from this sort of internalisation of dispute resolutions for every different sport and different types of decisions coming out of different sports. We can have one centralised body that determines and in many cases publishes decisions. So we've got something to work with for future national disputes.
I think one of the great advantages of that is when we start seeing decisions, precedents, people in sport could have a conversation with someone. So there's an on-field comment, like a sideline comment by a coach or a parent. I remember a long time ago when I was running, a coach of another athlete told me I was overweight. I was a 16-year-old girl. Can you imagine someone saying that now? But if we have those decisions and there can be a conversation going, that's not on, and it's not because I think it's not on, it's because the tribunal said it's not on, maybe we then we start educating people before the behaviour gets to a complaint stage.
Deterrent effect.
And you've hit the nail on the head. I think there's a significant educational piece in this, and there is fantastic educational resources. Sports Integrity Australia, they're accessible for free, and they work with Play by the Rules, and they cover a range of topics, and I think that's vital. But also for a national integrity manager or a complaints manager to go to clubs and make sure they understand the policy framework in which they're operating, and understand the standards of behaviour that's acceptable and not acceptable in whatever sport it is. I think that's vital, that face-to-face conduct, particularly at club level around parents. I think there's a real role to play in that education. It's hugely important.
I'm really interested. We've had a question come through. What is the value of an NSO coming to the tribunal with a complaint?
Look, in terms of adopting the tribunal as an NSO's complaints venue or jurisdiction for determining the dispute, I think there's a lot of benefit, because in my experience, having dealt with disputes of this kind for various different sporting bodies over the years, it's always a bit of a scramble to figure out how to deal with every different type of dispute, and sometimes there are policies in place which prescribe a particular procedure. It might prescribe that the matters are initially determined by somebody appointed from within the organisation, or it might refer it off to an external tribunal, which is to be comprised by the organisation and have a representative of the organisation on a tribunal panel. And there are always questions asked at that point in time as to how they do it, because it doesn't necessarily happen every day, probably happening more and more these days. But it's sometimes a bit of a scramble, particularly for the sports that don't have to deal with these sorts of things every day. So to have a system in place where you can perhaps have an initial dispute resolution mechanism determined internally, and then if there's an appeal or if there's a secondary decision that needs to be made, it gets referred directly off to the tribunal, and then the sport can not wipe its hands of it, but essentially hand over to an independent body that can make a determination. You don't have questions as to independence. That's something that often arises where a member of a sport has its the dispute determined by the CEO or somebody within the organisation. There's always a question as to whether the decision was independent or in that person's interests. To have an independent body that can also develop and draw from previous decisions from other sports in respect of a similar circumstance, that's of great value, and it gives some certainty as to where a dispute might go and how it might be handled, rather than sort of just walking in the dark and doing your best to follow your way through.
Is this, it's a big question, is there a way that the organisation can anticipate a timing or resourcing around that?
In terms of matters being dealt by the
so if they put it in there, what are they looking at?
Well, look, I mean, at the moment resourcing is okay because it's still in the pilot period and there's still sports taking up the opportunity to use the NST, but look, so things can be dealt with quite quickly, and the sports documentation documentation should provide for specific timeframes for things to be dealt with. Generally they do, they'll provide for a complaint to be made within a certain period of time and initial response another period of time, and that might be, as we were talking about before, these things sometimes need to happen very quickly, particularly if it's say it's an on-field dispute, on-field issue, and there's something that has to be determined before the next game, which is only in a week's time. You might need to convene an internal tribunal hearing within three days. So yeah, that's where it becomes very important to have internal processes, not just to deal with things that will be ultimately dealt with by the tribunal, but also to deal with things that will be dealt with internally because they don't fall within the jurisdiction of the tribunal. But yeah, in answer to your question, the tribunal at the moment can certainly deal with things very promptly.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from that is, provided the organisation is as prepared as possible with the process.
That's right. That you don't want to spend a week or 2 weeks trying to figure out how you deal with the dispute. You want to have that set out nice and clearly in your policies and procedures.
Rachel, I was going to say that's a challenge, a governance challenge for a lot of sporting organisations or charities, even large organisations, to have, I guess, the bandwidth to go, this is a governance issue we need to look at, because we're also looking at funding, and we're looking at sustainability, and we're looking at selecting the right coach, and we're looking at membership and attrition of players. And now we have to get our sports management policy into place, which a lot of people might think, even though we think it's really exciting, they might think it's really dry. So how do they tackle that governance issue with what resources, and what not just the human, but what knowledge resources? How do they tackle that issue?
Yeah, and spot on. We know that it's important, and the resources that are taken up, if they don't have the policies in place when they need to make decisions, is where the rubber hits the road. Any of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, sport is under-resourced. Sport, particularly Olympic sport, things are done on very, very tight budgets, and it's a multifaceted business. You have high performance, you have participation, you have governance requirements. There's so many requirements as an NSO and an SSO that you need for government funding, and it's public funding, so public need to have confidence in where their funding is going, and we've got increased commercialisation of a lot of sports, so that there are a number of complexities in this industry, and a number of issues that sporting organisations have to manage with very few resources. I think the National Integrity Framework requires a National Integrity Manager and Complaints Manager, which may or may not be the same person, and there's been funding available to at least assist sports for a period of time in establishing those roles. So there is some resources being provided by Sport Australia to assist sport, but resourcing is an issue across every sport since the dawn of time. Resourcing for the multifaceted nature of the business is always a complex issue that NSO and SSO CEOs have to manage. It's not easy in this industry.
Yeah, agree. Appreciating your time all here today, so thank you very much. And I'd just like to perhaps close off by giving each of you an opportunity for some final insights on the discussion today. John, moving forward, for your role, how do you see that helping the sports organisations, the presence of the tribunal and its assistance for organisations which are struggling with resourcing?
Resourcing is a huge issue throughout sport, and particularly at the grassroots level, with smaller clubs and state organisations and things like that. So over the years, I have seen sort of development of policies and procedures, which is good, and I've sat on a few different tribunals and seen those procedures evolving. I think take up of NIF and the NST as avenues to try and help manage those issues a little better than they have done in the past will be seen in the coming years. And so I'm looking forward to sort of seeing the sport across from grassroots all the way up to professional ranks and NSOs, to looking forward to seeing it sort of managed a bit better than it has been. And what is being put in place now will help to do that.
Excellent. Rachel?
I think that some of the points that I make, they go to issues that we've discussed already, is that if a complaint's badly managed, it could impact that person's relationship with sport, and then they may never play sport again. It never happens at a young age. So this is an important issue, because we know that sport's really important for people's welfare. We're talking about grassroots and Olympic sports. And a lot of people, it's like the point of pyramid. We need this many people playing grassroots to produce one. Kieran Perkins, the first name that came to my mind, that shows my age. But so if we can do anything, it's to educate those involved in sport that this national integrity framework's available, the NST is available, but even if your sport isn't part of an NSO, to not I guess, be wary of the complaints process, but to arm yourself now so that if there is a complaint, you as the person, your role in the sport is to do the best possible job you can to acknowledge it, manage it, communicate, make sure it's resolved independently, and there's an outcome that's good for the sport, the complainant and the respondent. Now I know that's nirvana and that might not happen, but if we all, if we're educating people towards that outcome with complaints management policy, then we're going to be better off.
And I think ultimately, in my experience, the outcome is actually by the by. People just want to make sure that they've had natural justice and that they've had a fair process. The outcome no one's ever happy with. But as long as a process has been followed and a policy has been followed, and they feel like they've been heard, both sides, that often is the resolution that they're looking for. It's actually the outcome, the sanction is irrelevant, really, at the end of the day. It's due process, a due process.
Yes.
So whether that's under the National Integrity Framework or another suite of policies, because it doesn't fit within prohibited conduct, it's that people feel that there has been a transparent process where everyone's had the opportunity to be heard, is ultimately the end game, because the outcome is quite irrelevant.
I think that sums it up perfectly. Thank you very much. I have fielded some questions as they've come through. We've covered off on them as we've discussed. However, I welcome you all to keep sending any questions through, because we would love to get back to you personally, and I'd love to take this opportunity to thank Anna, Rachel and John for discussing today the sports governance insights. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.